If you're a yoga teacher that struggles with cueing for anatomy and alignment, and maybe the reason your students have a hard time following directions is because your cues are confusing. I get it. You start studying anatomy and you want to tell everybody all the cool things that you know. The trick is that you need to know those cool things about anatomy and biomechanics, but you need to teach it to your students in a way that they can perform the action without even knowing what's going on, like magic. So if your cueing sounds like this, now class, as you reach forward and up, I want you to upwardly rotate the scapula into the axillary space and externally rotate the upper humerus in the glenohumeral joint as you extend through the spine. And maybe you go on to sound like this. And once you're here, I want you to engage the gluteus maximus to turn on the external rotation of the femoroacetabular joint and engage a posterior pelvic tilt so we can avoid dumping into the low back and lift through the heart. Well, that is confusing as hell to your students. They have no idea what any of that means, and they can't even perform the action. Also, as far as yoga is concerned, it totally takes them out of the practice. Now they're not thinking about the meditative state that they've gotten into as a result of practicing and breathing and being mindful. Now they just don't even know what's going on, and they're probably stressed out. So here's a slide from one of my anatomy courses. And in that course, I talk about internal versus external cueing. And that slide references some research where we looked at coaches using internal versus external cueing. So internal versus external cueing is internal is a cue that focuses on my own body, whereas external cueing is a focus on the environment around me. So one requires you to understand a lot about your own body and focus inward, whereas the other one is a task-oriented cue. Now, I know in yoga, a lot of times we like that internal focus, but it's actually very hard to follow directions with internal cueing. Here's two examples. So let's say we want to do a forward fold. Okay, we're standing up and we want to get to this forward fold position. So I could say something like, anteriorly tilt the pelvis and lift the tailbone as you send the weight into the heels and keep the heart lifted so you extend through the spine and make your way towards the ground. So that was a pretty internal cue. It was a lot of focus on my own bone structure and joint alignment. And it's pretty hard cue to follow unless you already know what an anterior tilt of the pelvis is and all of these kinds of things. But here's a way to make it fun and easy. So take a block and we can put this block down on the floor and we just want to say, okay, let's step forward. And all I want you to do is bend over and pick up the block. And then stand back up. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, but that doesn't get the flat spine that I wanted, and I wanted more of a hip hinge and less of a bending through the spine. Okay, but let's figure out a way to do it with without internal cueing. Let's do it with external cueing. Okay, so internal cueing, another example would be that we're trying to lengthen the spine out and forward. Okay, well, how do you lengthen your spine? We don't actually have any muscles that truly lengthen the spine. We can extend or flex or bend the spine, but we can't actually lengthen the spine. So again, that's confusing, but here's a way. Now, if you happen to have props, this is a cool way to do it. You can take a pole and you can say, all right, take the pole and hold it behind your back so that the pole is touching your head, your middle back between the shoulder blades, and your tailbone. Or if we want to say this another way, head, back, crack. So we've got 3 points of contact, and now it's a goal-oriented cue, which is, can you bend over and pick up the block in a way that you remain in contact with all 3 of those points on the pole? So head, back, crack. Can you pick up the pole, pick up the block and not lose contact with any of those 3 locations, right? If the pole lifts off of your butt or if your head moves away from it, then you fail the task, right? So now you can make it task oriented. That's kind of fun. But I realize that not everybody has those kinds of props available to them. So here's a cue that requires 0 props and gets the same point across and uses external cueing. So here we could say, all right, class, I want you to imagine that you've just stepped up to a long table, and that table is about the same height as your waist. Now you've stepped up to this table and there's a block way out as far as you can reach. Now you can't bend your knees and you can't move your hips forward. You have to reach as far as you can forward in order to grab that block. and then pull it closer to you again. And then we want to put the block back. So we got to bend over the table and reach as far as you possibly can and place the block there and then stand back up. Well, cool. You've just taught them how to hinge at the hip joints. You've taught them how to isolate their hip joints from their spine and you've taught them how to anteriorly tip the pelvis. You've taught them how to accomplish this task that you know involves some level of anatomy and biomechanics that you think is advantageous to their movement, but you've done it without confusing them and by giving them a simple task-oriented cue. Let's check out another example. Okay, so what about downward facing dog? What are some common cues for downward facing dog? One that I've heard is widen the sitting bones, which, by the way, that not only does that not make sense because your sitting bones are firmly attached and do not move. They don't move. I don't care what anybody says about there's a little bit of movement at the pubis and the SI joints. Yeah, so little. You cannot willingly widen your sitting bones, okay? It's not possible. So not only is it impossible, but it doesn't make sense. How do you even accomplish that task? Well, here's another cue that you could use instead. Okay, come into downward facing dog. Now imagine that your feet are glued to your mat, completely glued to your mat. And now you're going to try to pull them away from each other so much that you could rip your mat in half like two buns of a hot dog. So this is going to create a spreading action in the feet. Now, really, I like that cue a lot more when we're doing something like a squat, or in yoga, we might do Utkatasana. So that would be a useful cue there. Okay, let's say we're in downward facing dog and we're trying to get the students to really press into the floor so that we can get good upward rotation of the scapula and create good space in the glenohumeral joint and the shoulder joint so that we can avoid pinching sensations in the shoulder joint. Great idea, but how are you going to cue that? If you were internal cueing, you might say, oh, upwardly rotate the scapula and externally rotate the upper arm bones and, etc. But that's confusing. So if we use external cueing, then we can come into downward facing dog. And I want to say, all right, look at your elbows and bend your elbows and see where they go. Did your elbows go out to the side? Well, now I want you to bend your elbows. I want you to rotate your arms in such a way that if you bent your elbows, they'd go back towards your feet. That's how it should feel in your arms, is that if you bent your elbows, they would go back towards your feet. And another external cue here would be push the floor further away from you. So really push the floor away from you. All of those things are going to accomplish good upward rotation of the shoulder blade and external rotation of the humerus. Okay, one more. So we got we have an internal cue of, okay, come into downward facing dog, and I want you to lengthen the tailbone. You can't lengthen the tailbone. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't move. It's a fused joint. What are you going to do? That doesn't make any sense. Here's an external cue to accomplish what I think those people are going for. So what we're trying to avoid here is the rounding of the spine in downward facing dog. So we're trying to get them to anterior tilt the pelvis so the tailbone points more up towards the sky. Well, what's a simpler way of doing that? So one I like a lot in class is, okay, we're in downward facing dog. Imagine that you had tail feathers, and those tail feathers, I want you to aim your tail feathers straight up towards the sky. Or if you're kind of a lighthearted teacher and you don't take yourself too seriously, another good external cue in downward facing dog, here we are. Okay, now imagine that you've been holding a fart in the entire class, and now that everybody's in downward facing dog, I want you to fart above their heads so they don't smell it. So aim your fart up, not back towards your classmates. Up, up, up. So there are a lot of ways that we can use external cueing. Pick your poison. But the more that you go into detail about describing anatomy, we are going to have worse performance. So our students are going to have a harder time. They're going to perform worse. So when we describe anatomy to people, and there was a study that I showed you in that slide earlier from my Anatomy Demystified course on my website, and that study looked at internal cueing, where they basically said during sprinting they were telling the runners to squeeze the glutes as hard as they could, and that's an internal cue, and it led to worse performance compared to the group who was told to push off of the ground as hard as they could as they were sprinting. So pushing off the ground is an external cue, and those people had better sprinting times. They were better at doing the movement when they were given the instruction to push off the ground compared to people who were told to squeeze their glutes as they were running. So the external cue just did better. So if you want your students to actually have a better time, be less confused, be able to stay in the zone with that yogic meditation, meditative state during class, then consider using external cueing more often. And I think you and your students are going to have a better time. I'm Dr. Davis. Motion is lotion, movement is medicine. I'll see you in another video.